Ever wonder if your thoughts could, like, actually shape reality?
It's a question people have been wrestling with for centuries, right?
This time, you've given us quite the mix to unpack. We've got motivational speakers, blog posts that read like self-help guides, and even, get this, some quantum physics thrown in.
Yeah, a real grab bag of ideas about manifestation and the power of belief.
Mm.
Our mission, should we choose to accept it, is to see if there's any, I don't know, any there.
Right, like, do these pieces actually fit together?
Exactly.
Okay, so let's dive right in. One motivational speaker, we're looking at claims you can manifest desires. And get this, quickly, like we're talking 3 days.
3 days.
3 days. By, get this, vividly visualizing and embodying the feeling of already having what you want. They argue this sends a quote-unquote signal to the universe.
Okay, so this aligns with the whole law of attraction concept, the idea that like attracts like but applied to our thoughts and emotions.
Yeah.
It's about shifting from hoping to creating,
Yeah.
right? Aligning your energy with what you want.
And they use some pretty wild stories as proof. People manifesting crazy wealth, healing from serious illnesses, even finding love.
It's definitely compelling stuff.
But, and maybe this is just me being skeptical, I feel like they kind of gloss over the how. Like, how does this signaling the universe actually work?
Yeah, that's a fair point. It's
Yeah.
a lot of, it worked for me, so it'll work for you.
Ah,
Not a lot of, scientific evidence.
yeah.
Tough to say if it's the method or just random chance.
Right, exactly.
Correlation versus causation.
Uh-huh. Now, are you ready? Because things are about to get kind of quantum up in here.
Bring on the quantum.
Several sources we're looking at this time mention quantum physics, specifically the work of a guy named Greg Kuhn.
Okay, Greg Kuhn.
Yeah, and he actually says quantum physics explains how our thoughts directly impact reality.
Okay, so Kuhn's interpretation of quantum physics is definitely interesting. It's important to remember that it's an interpretation, not necessarily a universally accepted fact in the scientific community.
Fair enough. So for those of us who haven't cracked open a physics textbook lately, Kuhn talks about this thing called the observer effect.
Right, which basically states that tiny particles, like electrons, they kind of exist in this fuzzy state of potential until they're observed.
Fuzzy, huh?
Yeah, kind of like they haven't fully decided what they're going to be yet.
So they're waiting for us to, what, make up their minds for them?
In a way.
Yeah.
The act of observation, which could be influenced by our expectations, is what makes them collapse into one specific state or another. It's like our observation forces them to choose, makes them real, in a sense.
Okay, so going back to what you said about interpretations,
Right.
Kuhn uses the example of an atom to illustrate this. You know how an atom is mostly empty space?
Exactly. Even something that seems solid like a chair or a table is mostly made up of, well, nothingness.
Mind-blowing. And his point is that if matter at its core is essentially energy, and our thoughts and consciousness are also forms of energy, well, then maybe, just maybe, we have more influence over reality than we think.
Now that is the heart of the matter. And this is where things start to get really interesting.
No, absolutely. We're about to go down the rabbit hole. He even uses the famous double slit experiment to illustrate all of this.
Oh yeah, the double slit experiment, a classic.
So for our listeners who might not be PhDs in quantum mechanics,
Well, Thomas.
break this experiment down for us. What is it and why does it matter?
Okay, so picture a wall with 2 slits in it.
Got it.
Now imagine shooting tiny, tiny particles like electrons at this wall.
Okay, I can picture that.
Now, if these electrons were just acting like, say, little marbles, you'd expect to see, what, 2 groups of hits behind the slits on the other side, right? 2 lines of marble marks.
Makes sense to me.
But that's not what happens. Instead of 2 distinct groups, you get this pattern, almost like waves interfering with each other. It's as if each electron went through both slits at the same time.
Hold on, how is that even possible? Are they particles or are they waves? It's so confusing.
That's the million-dollar question, and that's the crux of quantum mechanics. Light and other particles can act like both a wave and a particle depending on how we're looking at them.
So they're like, what, shape-shifting?
In a way, they exist in this strange in-between state until they're measured, and then, boom, they have to choose.
So the act of us observing, of measuring these electrons, is actually influencing how they behave.
That's the wild part.
Wow. Okay, so follow me here. If our consciousness, our observation, can impact something as tiny as an electron, is it possible that it can influence bigger events in our lives? Is that what Kuhn is suggesting?
That's the big question, isn't it? And it's a question that has fueled countless debates, books, you name it.
A debt?
Kuhn and some other physicists believe that this observer effect, as we call it, might actually extend beyond these subatomic particles.
Oh.
They're suggesting that our consciousness, in a way, plays a role in shaping our reality.
So in a way, we're all part of this big, giant quantum physics experiment.
Maybe. It's a pretty mind-blowing thought, right? Even without, definitive scientific proof, there's something empowering about the idea that we're not just passive observers in our own lives. Maybe we're active creators.
Okay, I am officially down the rabbit hole. So where do we go from here?
Well, next, let's dig into the role of belief, which comes up a lot in these sources, and see how that fits into this whole quantum puzzle.
Okay, yeah, because that seems like a big piece of this whole manifesting your reality thing. Like how much of it is about what we believe versus, actual quantum mechanics.
Right. And if our beliefs are influencing things, are we then responsible for the bad stuff that happens?
Whoa, deep thought.
Deep dive, right.
Okay, so belief, responsibility. This is heavy stuff. But before we spiral into an existential crisis,
Which is always a risk on this show, right?
always, let's bring it back to something a little more concrete. Like, if our beliefs are so powerful, how do we actually change them? Because let's be honest, letting go of those deep-seated limiting beliefs, the ones that say, you're not good enough or you'll never achieve that, it's tough.
You're telling me it's like trying to rewire your brain.
Right. So where do we even begin?
Well, Greg Kuhn, our quantum physics guru, he actually addresses this head on. He talks about the importance of, not just visualizing a positive future, which we've talked about,
Right.
but also actively tackling those limiting beliefs that might be holding us back.
So it's like we're telling ourselves a story about our future, right?
Yeah.
And if it's all doom and gloom, well, we're probably going to subconsciously act in ways that make that story come true.
Exactly. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Okay, so how do we change the narrative?
Kuhn's advice is pretty simple, actually. He says, instead of asking yourself, what if it all goes wrong, ask yourself, what's the best that could happen?
Ooh, I like that. What's the best that could happen? It's like a little mental reset button.
It is. And it really highlights the power of just reframing our thinking.
Yeah.
Because sometimes it's not about, some big complicated process. Sometimes it's just about giving ourselves permission to see things differently.
It's about giving ourselves permission to hope, to dream.
Exactly. And you know what? Kuhn even goes so far as to say that people can use his name as a permission slip of sorts.
Yeah.
Like, hey, if anyone challenges your more optimistic outlook, you can be like, hey, Greg Kuhn said I could imagine a brighter future.
I love that. I'm totally using that. Greg Kuhn told me to think big. Okay, I want to shift gears for a second, though.
Sure.
Another concept that came up a few times in the sources we're looking at was this idea of surrender.
Interesting.
Yeah, and both the motivational speaker and Greg Kuhn talk about it,
Yeah.
which at first glance seems kind of counterintuitive, right? Like,
Right.
but if we're trying to manifest our dream life, why are we talking about surrender?
It does seem like a contradiction. But surrender, in this context, isn't about giving up. It's more about, how do I put it? It's about letting go of that need to micromanage every little detail of how things are supposed to play out. It's about trusting that there might be a bigger plan, maybe even something better than we can imagine that's already in motion.
So it's more like having faith, right? Like, okay, I've done my part. I've put my intentions out there. I believe in my vision. Now I'm letting go and trusting the process.
Exactly. It's about releasing that fear and anxiety that so often block things from, flowing naturally.
So it's not about being passive then.
No, it's quite the opposite, actually. That's where inspired action comes into play.
Inspired action.
Yeah, it's not about forcing things to happen, but rather being open and alert to opportunities when they pop up, trusting your intuition, and then, taking action.
So it's kind of a delicate balance then between going after what you want and also surrendering to the process. We set our intentions, we take inspired action, and then we let go, trusting that at the end of the day, whatever happens is for the best.
You nailed it. And, this makes me think back to the double slit experiment you explained earlier.
Oh, right. Back to quantum physics.
Exactly. Maybe we can break that down even further, for those of us who haven't taken a physics class in a while.
Please, a little refresher. Never hurt anyone.
Okay, so remember that wall, the one with the two slits, and we're shooting tiny particles, like electrons, at it.
Yeah, like a subatomic shooting range.
Perfect. Now, we said if those electrons were just acting like solid little marbles, you'd see two groups of hits behind the slits, right?
Right. 2 lines of marble marks. Makes sense.
Exactly. But, and here's where it gets strange.
Oh, boy.
They don't make two distinct groups. No.
Yeah. Cool.
Instead, we see this pattern. And the pattern looks a lot like waves interfering with each other. It's as if each electron goes through both slits at the same time.
What? Even though we're firing them one by one? How?
Exactly. And that, my friend, is one of the biggest mysteries of quantum mechanics.
So what you're saying is they're acting like waves even though they're particles.
In a nutshell, yep. Or, well, they're acting like both. It's like until we measure them, they're this blurry mix of possibilities, this wave spread out. And then, when we look, boom, they have to choose one state, one slit, and act like a particle.
Okay, so they're like chameleons, changing depending on who's watching.
Kind of. They exist in this state of pure potential until they're observed. And that very act of observation, that measurement, it seems to be influencing how they behave.
So our consciousness matters. Our very act of looking at these electrons is changing the outcome. This is blowing my mind.
It's pretty wild, right?
Wild. Okay, so back to the big question. If our consciousness can influence something as small as an electron, is it possible it also impacts things on a much larger scale, like our thoughts influencing our health, or our relationships, or, I don't know, our financial situation?
That is the million-dollar question. And the answer is, nobody knows for sure.
Frustrating, but also exciting.
Exactly. It's a question that's fueled countless debates. And like we were saying earlier, some physicists, like our buddy Greg Kuhn, believe that this observer effect might extend beyond subatomic particles.
So our consciousness is playing a role in shaping our reality.
Potentially. It's a pretty radical idea, isn't it? But even if we don't have all the answers, I think there's something undeniably empowering about considering the possibility.
Right. It's almost as if the universe or maybe even our own consciousness is saying, hey, you have more power than you think. You're not just along for the ride. You're the one behind the wheel.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, then the question becomes, well, what kind of reality do you want to create?
Okay, I feel like my brain is officially overflowing with quantum foam at this point.
It's a lot to digest.
It is. But I also kind of love how these sources, even with their different approaches, they all kind of circle back to this idea of us having more agency than we realize.
Absolutely. Whether it's the motivational speaker urging us to visualize our dream life, or Greg Kuhn talking about the observer effect and those pesky limiting beliefs.
It all boils down to this. We're not just passive bystanders in our own lives, are we?
Not if we don't want to be. But to your point, it can feel overwhelming. Like, okay, cool, thoughts, energy, quantum entanglement. But how do we actually apply any of this in our day-to-day lives? Where's the instruction manual for reality creation?
Right. It can't all be theoretical. So what are some, I don't know, some practical takeaways, something our listeners can do today to start shifting their reality, or at least their perception of it?
Well, I think the first step is simply becoming more aware. Aware of our thoughts, our beliefs, and how those might be influencing our experiences.
Okay, so self-awareness. Check.
Because even if you're not entirely sold on this whole thoughts create reality thing, there's no denying the power of things like visualization and positive self-talk.
Right. Those are pretty standard self-improvement tools.
Exactly. And for good reason. Think about it. When you take the time to create a clear vision of what you want, when you really allow yourself to feel those positive emotions associated with achieving that goal, well, it's going to shift something within you.
It's like you're priming your brain for action, right? Instead of just vaguely wishing for something, you're giving your subconscious a very specific target to aim for, and that can make all the difference.
Exactly. And that's where those limiting beliefs come in. Because, like we were saying before, if you're telling yourself, I could never do that, or I'm not good enough, well, your brain's going to be like, okay, boss, those are your orders. Let's make sure those beliefs become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
So not only do we need to visualize what we do want, but we also have to actively challenge and reframe those negative thought patterns that tell us we can't have it.
It's a constant process of weeding the garden, so to speak.
Love that analogy. So we've talked about visualization, challenging limiting beliefs. What about this whole surrender thing? Because I'll be honest, that one still trips me up a bit.
Yeah, it's a tough one. Because it's easy to misinterpret it as passivity, right? Like, okay, universe, I'm just going to sit here and wait for my dream life to fall into my lap.
Right. But that's not what we're talking about, is it?
Not at all. Surrender, in this context, is more about acknowledging that we're not in control of everything.
It's that trust thing again.
Right. It's about trusting that there's an intelligence, a flow to life that's bigger than us. And that sometimes the best thing we can do is get out of our own way.
Which isn't always easy. I'm a bit of a control freak, as you know.
Aren't we all, to some extent? But I think that's where things like meditation and mindfulness come in. Those practices help us cultivate that space between our thoughts, where we can observe without judgment and learn to let go a little bit.
It's about finding that sweet spot, right?
Yeah,
Between taking inspired action toward our goals and also being open to the possibility that the universe might have something even better in store for us.
you got it. And you know what else I think is crucial? Gratitude.
Gratitude, yes.
Because it's so easy to get caught up in that cycle of not enoughness, right? Like, I'll be happy when. But when we shift our focus to what we're already grateful for, it changes our whole vibration.
It's about appreciating the journey, not just the destination.
Precisely. And, that feeling of gratitude is like a magnet for even more good things come into our lives.
Okay, I am feeling so many things right now. Hopeful,
Mm,
inspired, maybe a little overwhelmed, but in a good way.
good. A little discomfort means we're stretching, right?
Hmm.
Expanding our minds, our beliefs, maybe even our reality.
I love that. And it's funny because when we first started this deep dive, I have to admit, I was pretty skeptical. I mean, quantum physics, the law of attraction, it all sounded a little woo-woo to me, to be honest.
I get it. It's
Yeah.
definitely a trip down the rabbit hole. But that's the beauty of exploration, isn't it? We have to be willing to question what we think we know, to remain open to new possibilities.
Because who knows, right? Maybe those things we dismiss as woo-woo are actually just glimpses into a much bigger, more interconnected reality than we ever imagined.
Maybe it's all connected, right? Our thoughts, our beliefs, the energy of the universe. And maybe, just maybe, we have the power to influence it all, even in small ways.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the power of visualization to the mysteries of quantum physics and everything in between.
It's been quite the deep dive.
To all our listeners out there, whether you're fully on board with the law of attraction or approaching it with a healthy dose of skepticism, we hope this conversation has sparked something within you.
Maybe it's a sense of curiosity, a desire to explore further.
Or maybe it's simply a renewed sense of possibility, because at the end of the day, isn't that what it's all about? Remembering that we are powerful creators, capable of shaping our reality in ways we might not even fully comprehend yet.
I think so. And you know what? Maybe that's a good place to leave it for today, with a little more wonder, a little more curiosity, and a whole lot of possibility for what's to come.
Beautifully said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, keep those minds open and those intentions high.